The following content may include discussions or topics that could be triggering or upsetting to individuals who have experienced similar traumas. Viewer discretion is advised.
There was a time when David Mayo stood at the very heart of Scientology. He wasn't just any auditor. He was the man that L. Ron Hubbard trusted above everyone else to carry out the church's most secretive, powerful techniques. He helped to shape Scientology's core teachings, guiding followers through levels most of us can't even imagine. But then, in a shocking twist, David Mayo was cast out, declared an enemy. He was labeled a suppressive person, or an SP, by the very church he'd helped to build. Just imagine, one day you're on the inside, trusted with the deepest secrets, and the next you're on the outside, cut off, fighting for your reputation and your life. How does someone go from being Hubbard's right-hand man to one of the most feared enemies of Scientology? What did Mayo know? And why was the church so desperate to silence him? In this episode, we'll take a deep dive into David Mayo's rise within Scientology, his close relationship with L. Ron Hubbard, and his pivotal role in developing their most sacred techniques. And we'll uncover the intense battle that followed when he was declared a suppressive person. So what really happens when one of Scientology's most influential figures turns against the church? Let's find out. I'm Sandy McKenna, and along with Abraham Ulrich, welcome to the Sins of Scientology.
David Mayo was born in New Zealand in 1940, and like many who would later become deeply involved in Scientology, he was searching for something beyond the conventional. Not much is widely known about his childhood or early years before he encountered Scientology, but by the 1960s, Mayo was already seeking spiritual answers. He was drawn to Scientology partly due to its promise about self-improvement and spiritual advancement, something that appealed to many people of that era, as it was a time when new spiritual movements were growing in popularity worldwide. Mayo began studying Scientology in New Zealand, likely around the mid-1960s. He demonstrated an early aptitude for auditing, the church's unique form of spiritual counseling. Auditing sessions involve the use of an e-meter, a device that is said to measure the spiritual state of a person as they answer questions. Those who excelled in auditing were highly valued in Scientology, and it wasn't long before Mayo's talents were noticed. By the late 1960s, Mayo had not only become a skilled auditor, but he had also fully dedicated himself to Scientology. He made the significant decision to join the Sea Organization, the elite and militaristic branch of Scientology that is responsible for running the organization's day-to-day operations. The Sea Org is known for its extreme level of commitment, with members signing a billion-year contract to symbolize their dedication to the movement across multiple lifetimes. Joining the Sea Org also meant working closely with the upper echelons of Scientology, and Mayo quickly distinguished himself. His sharp mind, profound belief in the teachings of L. Ron Hubbard, and mastery of auditing made him stand out. He was a natural fit for the intense demands of Sea Org life and began rising rapidly through the ranks. As Mayo's reputation grew, so did his responsibilities within the organization. By the 1970s, L. Ron Hubbard had taken a special interest in him, and Mayo was entrusted with delivering Scientology's highest-level auditing processes, including the operating Thetan levels, or OT levels. The OT levels are some of the most secretive and controversial teachings within Scientology, believed to unlock a person's full potential and free them from the confines of the physical universe. In particular, Mayo became known for his ability to deliver new-era Dianetics for operating Thetans, NED for OTs, a process that was created after Hubbard reportedly suffered a stroke in the late 1970s. Hubbard was said to have entrusted Mayo with developing this advanced auditing process as part of his recovery. This close relationship between Hubbard and Mayo was seen as a significant mark of trust, as very few were allowed to work with Hubbard directly. let alone help shape new levels of the Scientology bridge to total freedom. Mayo was also believed to have personally audited Hubbard, a prestigious and high-stakes role within the church. Auditing the founder of Scientology himself placed Mayo at the pinnacle of the organization's spiritual hierarchy. At the time, the organization touted Hubbard's own spiritual advancement as proof of the efficacy of auditing, so having someone as trusted as Mayo in this role was crucial. David Mayo's work didn't stop with Hubbard. He also became the go-to auditor for high-ranking Sea Org members and prominent Scientologists. His role often involved handling the most difficult and complex cases within the church from a spiritual and organizational perspective. As one of Scientology's top technical minds, Mayo was part of a select group deeply involved in developing and refining Scientology's auditing technology and processes. His understanding of Scientology's tech, a term used to describe its spiritual and auditing methods, was unparalleled, making him revered within the organization. Mayo's reputation within Scientology was both a blessing and a burden. On the one hand, he was respected and admired for his skills and contributions to advancing Scientology's spiritual technology. On the other hand, this prominence also made him a potential rival for others within the organization, especially as power struggles within the leadership began to emerge, particularly around the time when L. Ron Hubbard was in hiding due to legal battles. By the late 1970s and early 80s, Mayo had become one of the most influential figures in the church, often seen as a technical authority on Hubbard's teachings. However, this role put him in a precarious position as David Miscavige, a rising figure in Scientology, began consolidating power. Mayo's position as Hubbard's favorite auditor made him a threat to the internal dynamics of the church, and his rise may have sparked jealousy and competition among other senior members.
Ned for OTs, or New Era Dianetics for operating Thetans, was considered revolutionary within the church. It was built on earlier principles of Dianetics, but was tailored to address what Hubbard called the spiritual blockages that prevented OTs from fully realizing their potential. It was said to be one of the most effective methods for freeing individuals from their past traumas, also referred to as engrams in Scientology. Hubbard publicly endorsed this new technique, which helped elevate David Mayo's status as a technical leader within the organization. Mayo's development of this process solidified his place as one of Hubbard's closest and most trusted associates during this time, and it was through this effort that he earned the title of Senior Case Supervisor International. While Hubbard was a figurehead, Mayo became known as the man behind the curtain, responsible for implementing and overseeing these new, advanced auditing techniques. His role in creating NED for OTs was so pivotal that Mayo effectively became the face of technical advancement within Scientology. Mayo's close relationship with Hubbard was not just professional, it was personal. After Hubbard's stroke, Mayo acted as his personal auditor, tasked with guiding Hubbard through his own spiritual recovery using the very techniques Hubbard himself had created. This was no small responsibility. Auditing someone, particularly at the highest levels of Scientology, was seen as an intensely private and sacred process. Being Hubbard's auditor placed Mayo in an incredibly privileged position within the church. In many ways, David Mayo became the guardian of Scientology's most sensitive and high-level processes. He was the one to whom Hubbard turned when he needed help or when new issues arose that required technical innovation. Mayo's role wasn't just limited to auditing Hubbard. He was responsible for overseeing the auditing of top-level Sea Org members and influential Scientologists. He became a central figure in ensuring that Hubbard's vision for the upper levels of Scientology, particularly the OT levels, was being delivered effectively. His mastery over the technical side of Scientology meant that he wielded immense power, especially within the Sea Org, where auditing was one of the key tools used for spiritual advancements and control. His presence was so significant that many Scientologists believed that Mayo was the only person qualified to take over the technical leadership of the church should anything happen to Hubbard. In fact, within Scientology circles, Mayo's knowledge of the auditing processes was seen as crucial to ensuring that Scientology could continue functioning at its highest levels. Despite his power and close relationship with Hubbard, David Mayo's position within the church would become increasingly precarious in the early 1980s. By this time, David Miscavige, who would later become the undisputed leader of Scientology, was rapidly rising through the ranks. Miscavige, known for his aggressive and authoritarian style, was consolidating power within the organization. His rise was marked by desire to centralize control, which put him at odds with many senior church members, including Mayo. One of the key tensions between Mayo and Miscavige centered around control over the tech and its application. As Senior Case Supervisor International, Mayo held immense sway over the technical aspects of Scientology, which included auditing and spiritual processes that were essential to the organization's identity. Miscavige, however, wanted full control over the church's operations and was known for his willingness to oust anyone he saw as a threat to his authority. Mayo's close relationship with Hubbard, his development of Ned for OTs, and his role as Hubbard's personal auditor made him a formidable figure within Scientology's leadership structure. However, his prominence also made him a target. Miscavige saw Mayo's influence over the technical aspects of Scientology as a threat to his growing power. Reports from former Scientologists suggest that Miscavige began maneuvering to marginalize Mayo, undermining his authority and planting the seeds for Mayo's eventual expulsion. The exact nature of the conflict between Mayo and Miscavige remains somewhat shrouded in secrecy, but it is clear Miscavige viewed Mayo as a rival. As Hubbard became more and more reclusive and less involved in the day-to-day running of Scientology, Miscavige's influence grew, and Mayo's position became increasingly vulnerable. By 1982, tensions reached a breaking point. Mayo was abruptly declared a suppressive person, and despite his years of service and deep involvement in its most sacred processes, this designation led to Mayo's immediate expulsion from the church. Miscavige's rapid consolidation of power meant that even someone as influential as Mayo could be removed if seen as a potential rival. Mayo's expulsion marked an end of an era within Scientology. The man who had once been Hubbard's most trusted technical leader was now ostracized, and David Miscavige took complete control of the organization, steering it in a more authoritarian direction. In the years that followed, Mayo would go on to challenge Scientology legally, creating the Advanced Ability Center, AAC, an independent Scientology splinter group. But the full force of Scientology's legal machine would be brought upon him.
In 1982, something happened that sent shockwaves through the world of Scientology. David Mayo, once one of L. Ron Hubbard's most trusted and loyal associates, was suddenly declared a suppressive person, or SP, and expelled from the church. For those unfamiliar with the term, being declared an SP is the ultimate condemnation within Scientology. It's a label reserved for individuals considered enemies of the church. Once someone is branded as such, they are entirely cut off, not only from the organization, but from their family, friends, and anyone still involved in Scientology. So how does someone like David Mayo, who was so high up, fall so dramatically? On the surface, the official reason given for Mayo's expulsion was that he was accused of altering Hubbard's tech, the methods and practices that are the foundation of Scientology's spiritual processes. Altering the tech is a serious offense in the church, tantamount to hearsay, but those close to Mayo and even many who later left Scientology have suggested that the real reason for his fall was tied to a power struggle at the highest level of the organization. At the center of the struggle was David Miscavige, at the time, a young ambitious Sea Org member who had rapidly risen through the ranks. By the late 1970s, Miscavige began consolidating power, especially as L. Ron Hubbard became reclusive following his stroke. While Hubbard was still technically in charge, it was clear that Miscavige was positioning himself to control the future of Scientology. And Mayo, with his deep knowledge of the auditing processes and his close relationship with Hubbard, he was seen as a potential rival. As Miscavige's influence grew, so did the tensions. Mayo, who had been working closely with Hubbard for years, was viewed as a threat by Miscavige. Some reports suggest that Mayo's position as a trusted auditor, his leadership, and the loyalty he inspired among other Scientologists made him a target. If Miscavige was going to secure his control, he needed to eliminate anyone who could challenge him, and that meant David Mayo had to go. In 1982, the axe fell. Mayo was declared an SP, effectively purging him from the organization. For someone who had dedicated his life to Scientology, being expelled was a devastating blow. And for the people who looked up to Mayo, it was a moment of shock and disbelief. His fall was sudden, and with it, any connection he had to the world of Scientology was severed. But Mayo wasn't the type to fade into the background quietly. Soon after expulsion, he founded the Advanced Ability Center, AAC, in Santa Barbara, California. The AAC was essentially a breakaway group where Mayo and a few former Scientologists continued to practice and offer auditing services based on the techniques he had developed while inside the church. It was a bold move, and it wasn't long before the Church of Scientology took notice and action. The AAC attracted several disaffected Scientologists, especially those who had become critical of the increasingly authoritarian direction the church was taking under David Miscavige's leadership. Mayo centers provided them with a way to continue their spiritual practice without the strict control of the church hierarchy. For many, it was a place of refuge, but Scientology's leadership wasn't going to let Mayo operate freely. In the eyes of the church, he was committing the ultimate sin, using their technology outside of their control. So they launched a fierce legal campaign against him, filing lawsuits to stop him from delivering auditing services and accusing him of copyright infringements for using processes that the church claimed ownership of. The church also went after Mayo with what has been described as a campaign of harassment. The fair game policy, which allows Scientology to take extreme measures against those declared as SPs, meant that Mayo and his supporters faced constant legal pressures, personal attacks, and public denigration. The legal battle between Mayo's AAC and the Church of Scientology became protracted and bitter. Mayo's center was sued multiple times, with the church using its vast resources to wear down Mayo and his supporters. The lawsuits focused on the church's claim that auditing processes, such as NET for OTs, were proprietary and could not be used outside Scientology. The legal and financial strain eventually forced the AAC to close its doors in the late 1980s, bringing an end to Mayo's public fight. But even though the AAC was shut down, the legacy of Mayo's challenge to Scientology lingered. His case exposed the internal power struggles within the church and highlighted the extent to which Scientology was willing to go to protect its control over its spiritual technology. And for Mayo, although he had lost the legal battle, he had gained something perhaps even more important, a sense of freedom and independence from the organization he had once served so loyally. Let's examine this clip of David Mayo.
There's a dispatch that's often been mentioned by various people, and I'll mention it again today because there's not a great deal known about it, that I received in April of 1982, and I consider it one of the most significant dispatches that I've received from LRH. In April of 1982, I got this dispatch from him, and it was about 20-odd pages long, single-space typed. It was quite a long one. And he described what he expected to happen in the future and over the next 20 to 25 years. Although he'd been training me to do this for some time, and I'd known that he wanted me to be able to carry on and release these OT levels when the time came. In this dispatch, he actually formally stated it in writing. That's what he wanted me to do. And at the time, he said he was actually turning the hat over. He also told me at the time that he expected to live for a minimum of a few months and perhaps a couple of years at the most. There were several paragraphs in which he told me not to get upset about the idea of him dropping his body and so on, and pointed out, and I'm mentioning this because I think it's relevant and I think most people should know it, that it wasn't something to be sad about or anything. He'd accomplished what he'd set out to accomplish in this lifetime, which was basically to map out the bridge, and he'd done that. And he said that even if it was possible to extend his life, he didn't particularly have any great desire to do so in this body. He wanted to go on and be able to start a new game. And he also estimated that he would be gone for some time, He didn't say doing what, but he said he would be, and he asked me basically to look after three things to do with the tech. One was overseeing the quality of delivery of tech by other people and to ensure that a high-quality delivery continued, to look over the actual technical materials from time to time because they would need updating as society changed, and then at suitable times in the future to release the as yet unreleased OT levels. And he's made a point in there that by the time I and others had gotten up through these levels ourselves, we would find that it was possible to continue on with the research ourselves, and that he felt that the future was now secure in that he didn't have to be around forever to continue on mapping the route out. He'd done sufficient on that, and he therefore felt that he'd fulfilled his goals and what he called his obligations to mankind and could go off and do something else. But he said he would check back in 20 to 25 years to ensure it was all going well and so on.
When David Mayo was declared a suppressive person back in 1982, the Church of Scientology didn't just cut ties with him, it launched a full-scale offensive. It was clear from the start that the church wasn't going to let Mayo go quietly. His knowledge of upper levels of Scientology's tech, especially his role in developing new era Dianetics for operating thetans, Ned for OTs, made him a direct threat. The church had invested years promoting Mayo as one of their brightest stars, and now he was on the outside, using the same knowledge in ways they couldn't control. The legal battle began almost immediately after Mayo founded the Advanced Ability Center in Santa Barbara. The church claimed that Mayo was using their intellectual property, the techniques and auditing processes he had helped refine, without permission. Central to the lawsuits was the assertion that Mayo's use of Ned for OTs violated Scientology's copyrights, a move that was as much about protecting their financial interests as it was about maintaining control over their spiritual techniques. The church filed multiple lawsuits against Mayo and his AAC, hitting him with claims of copyright infringement, trade secret violations, and unfair competition. These lawsuits were designed to be relentless, aimed at not only shutting down Mayo's operation, but draining him financially. In the church's view, allowing Mayo to continue offering Scientology-style auditing outside of their structure set a dangerous precedent. If other former members began doing the same, Scientology's tight control over its tech could unravel. Beyond the courtroom, the church is reported to have unleashed another weapon in its arsenal, the infamous fair game policy. According to this policy, anyone declared an enemy of the church or an SP could be lied to, sued, tricked, or destroyed. Mayo was no exception. Former Scientologists and critics of the church have long alleged that the church employed harassment tactics aimed at breaking them down personally, professionally, and emotionally. There were reports of intimidation and surveillance with private investigators allegedly following Mayo, scrutinizing his every move and attempting to gather any information that could be used against him. The goal was to make life so unbearable that he would either stop his breakaway efforts or be unable to continue his legal battles. It wasn't just about winning in court, but about making Mayo feel the full weight of what it meant to defy Scientology. This legal and personal onslaught was a massive show of force, a reminder to all former members that leaving the church didn't mean you could escape its reach. Scientology has a long history of aggressively pursuing those who it perceives as enemies, and Mayo's case was no different. For David Mayo, the relentless legal battles took an enormous toll, both professionally and personally. At first, he scored some early victories in court, as judges initially sided with him on certain legal claims, pushing back on Scientology's aggressive tactics. This gave Mayo and his supporters a glimmer of hope that the church's legal stranglehold could be broken. But Scientology, with its vast financial resources, was in it for the long haul. They continued to file new claims, appeal court decisions, and pursue every legal avenue to drain Mayo's time, energy, and financial resources. The church was well known for its strategy of litigation by attrition, not necessarily aiming to win each battle outright, but to overwhelm their opponents with an endless barrage of lawsuits, paperwork, and legal fees. For Mayo, this meant years of fighting, not just for his right to operate the AAC, but for his livelihood. The emotional strain was immense. Imagine pouring your life's work into something only to have it ripped away by the organization you had once been devoted to. And now that very organization was determined to destroy everything you had built outside of it. The cost of defending himself against such a powerful adversary drained Mayo's resources. Each new legal challenge required more money, time, and emotional resilience. Mayo was facing a machine that never stopped, and eventually he had to make a difficult choice: settle. Settling meant that Mayo could no longer continue to operate the AAC the way he had envisioned. The center, once a haven for former Scientologists looking for a more independent path, closed its doors. The church had won, in a sense, not necessarily because it proved their case in court, but because they had worn Mayo down. The emotional toll was just as severe. Mayo had been at the top of Scientology's hierarchy, trusted by L. Ron Hubbard himself and lauded for his technical brilliance. Now he was a man without a movement, ostracized from the very community he had once helped to lead. This sense of betrayal, combined with the years of legal harassment, took a deep emotional toll on him. Many who knew Mayo during this time said that he had become more withdrawn, and the constant stress of battling Scientology had left him drained. While the exact details of the settlement are not public, it's clear that Mayo was forced to retreat from public life. The Advanced Ability Center, once a beacon of hope for a disillusioned Scientologist, was now gone. And for Mayo, this marked the end of his public fight against the church. The legal system may have offered him some brief reprieves, but in the end, the sheer weight of Scientology's legal and financial power was just too much to overcome. David Mayo's story isn't just about one man's rise and fall within the Church of Scientology. It's a reflection of how the church operates on a much broader scale, particularly when it comes to its treatment of higher-ranking defectors. Mayo's experience isn't unique, and it reveals a pattern of behavior that has repeated itself with other prominent members who have dared to leave or challenge the church. The Church of Scientology has long been known for protecting its inner workings at all costs, especially for those who held positions of influence. When someone like David Mayo, once L. Ron Hubbard's most trusted auditor, decides to leave or is forced out, the church's response is swift and severe. It's not about severing ties with that person. It's about making sure they are publicly discredited, isolated, and in many cases, legally and personally destroyed. Think about other prominent defectors like Mike Rinder, who was once the head of the church's Office of Special Affairs, or Marty Rathbun, another high-ranking member who left and faced a barrage of attacks. Both men, like Mayo, were once deeply embedded in the core of Scientology's leadership. When they left, they didn't just walk away, they became targets. The church launched campaigns of harassment against them using the fair game policy, which allowed them to be sued, lied to, and even stalked. In Mayo's case, his position as the technical mind behind so much of Scientology's auditing processes made him a particular threat. Just like Rinder and Rathbun, Mayo wasn't simply a follower, but an architect of the church's core teachings. The same thing happened to Ron Miscavige, David Miscavige's own father, who left Scientology and later wrote about the extreme surveillance and intimidation tactics used against him. The church has a well-oiled machine for handling defectors, especially those once in positions of power. It's not just about cutting ties. It's about erasing the defectors' influence, ensuring they no longer have a voice that could sway other members. Like many others, Mayo found himself in that machine's crosshairs. Scientology couldn't afford to have someone of his stature freely operating outside the church, delivering some auditing processes they claimed ownership of. This tactic of erasure and discrediting doesn't just silence the individual. It serves as a warning to others still within the church. It tells members that leaving Scientology isn't just about walking away. It's about facing the full weight of the organization's legal and personal resources. Mayo's experience is a powerful illustration of how Scientology controls its narrative by controlling the fate of those who step out of line, and it echoes in the stories of every high-ranking defector since.
But here's the thing. No matter how hard Scientology tried to erase David Mayo, his legacy lived on. Despite the lawsuits, the harassment, the character attacks, for many years Mayo was responsible for refining and implementing some of Scientology's most advanced processes, especially at the operating thetan levels. He helped develop Net for OTs, a cornerstone of the church's spiritual practices. When he left Scientology and started the Advanced Ability Center, AAC, Mayo wasn't just running a breakaway group. He was continuing what he saw as the true spiritual mission of Scientology. Many who had become disillusioned with the authoritarian direction of the church under David Miscavige found refuge in Mayo's center. These former members didn't see Mayo as a traitor or a villain. They saw him as a preserver of the original tech. In fact, for some ex-Scientologists, Mayo represented the purer, less commercialized version of Scientology. His breakaway group, the AAC, was about getting back to the heart of what they believed L. Ron Hubbard's teachings were meant to be. While the church was focused on expanding its real estate holdings and securing tax-exempt status, Mayo's followers saw him as someone who was still genuinely focused on spiritual advancement. Even after the AAC was forced to close, Mayo's influence didn't disappear. Many former members who left Scientology during that time still held on to the auditing techniques they learned from him, passing them on to independent Scientology communities that continue to exist today. These groups, often referred to as the Free Zone, are comprised of people who still practice Scientology's auditing processes, but outside of the control of the official church, and for much of what they practice is rooted in Mayo's work. Decades later, Mayo's contributions to the technical side of Scientology are still discussed and respected in these circles. While the church did its best to bury his legacy, former members remember him as someone who dared to defy the institution, not by rejecting Scientology outright, but by trying to bring it back to what he believed it was truly meant to be. In a way, Mayo's story is one of spiritual integrity. He never stopped believing in the power of the auditing tech, even after the church had cast him out. For many former Scientologists, especially those in the Free Zone, Mayo's willingness to stand up to the church's leadership and continue practicing the tech on his own terms makes him a figure of admiration. He is someone who refused to be controlled and understood the power of what he had helped build, but wasn't willing to let it be monopolized by a single institution.
One of the most notable testimonials comes from Jesse Prince, a former high-ranking member of the Church of Scientology who later became a vocal critic of the organization. Prince has spoken about his interactions with David Mayo during their time within Scientology in interviews and public statements. Prince described Mayo as a deeply thoughtful and committed individual who genuinely believed in the power of Scientology's auditing processes. Prince recounts how Mayo's downfall within the organization directly resulted from his opposition to David Miscavige's consolidation of power. In an interview, Prince reflected on the sharp contrast between Mayo's approach, focused on spiritual advancement and auditing, and Miscavige's growing authoritarian control over the church. According to Prince, Mayo was seen as a threat, not because he was disloyal, but because he was too influential and knowledgeable about Scientology's core tech.
Another prominent figure who has spoken about David Mayo is Amy Scobee, a former Sea Org executive who has since become a vocal critic of Scientology. In interviews and in her book, Scientology Abuse at the Top, Scobee talks about how Mayo's expulsion from Scientology was a turning point for many within the organization. Scobee recounts that when Mayo was declared an SP, it sent shockwaves through the ranks. For many, Mayo represented the true spirit of Scientology's technical side, and his departure made some question the direction the church was taking under David Miscavige. Scobee mentions how several high-ranking Scientologists like herself quietly questioned Miscavige's leadership after seeing how someone as respected as Mayo was treated. She credits Mayo with planting the seed of doubt that eventually led her and many others to leave Scientology altogether.
One of the most revealing sources of testimonials comes from those who were part of Mayo's breakaway group, the Advanced Ability Center, AAC, in Santa Barbara. For many, the AAC was a safe haven, a place where they could continue their spiritual journey without the rigid authoritarianism that had overtaken Scientology under Miscavige. Several former AAC members shared their experiences working with Mayo in interviews and personal writings. They describe him as humble, kind, and deeply committed to helping others through auditing. Unlike the church's increasingly commercialized and authoritarian nature, Mayo's AAC was seen as a return to what many believed was the original spirit of Scientology, focused on spiritual growth and personal freedom. Speaking in an interview, one former AAC member said, "David was nothing like what we'd been taught to believe about leadership in Scientology. He wasn't about power or control. He genuinely believed in the tech and wanted to help people." Another former member reflected on how Mayo's version of Scientology at the AAC felt less about dogma and more about personal exploration. It felt like we were reclaiming something that had been lost. David gave us back the freedom to practice what we believed in without fear or control.
Laurie Hamilton, an auditor and member of the AAC, gave detailed account of her experiences working with Mayo in interviews and on message boards dedicated to former Scientologists. Hamilton credited Mayo with restoring her faith in Scientology's original teachings. She said that Mayo's leadership at the AAC made her realize that the church under David Miscavige had become a bastion of control, far removed from the principles it was founded on. Hamilton described Mayo as genuinely interested in spiritual enlightenment, not in controlling people. She said he believed in the power of auditing to help people, but it was never about coercion. It was about spiritually getting people to a better place, not trapping them in some system. Her reflections echo those of many who left the church and joined Mayo's breakaway group. They saw him as a true believer who understood the tech at a deep level, but rejected the authoritarian control that had taken over the church after David Miscavige. Here's Mary Freeman, another former member of the Church of Scientology.
That also goes for David Mayo. I didn't know David Mayo, but I said, hey, you're going to tell me the person that L. Ron Hubbard picked to be the highest trained, highest classed CS for the entire world, the top case supervisor, that was his personal auditor, that he chose, who helped him when he was sick, who helped him develop the Knots rundown, and audited him and got him well at that time. I said, you're going to tell me that person, David Mayo, woke up one day and turned into an SP? I'm sorry. I can't make myself that stupid.
What emerges from these interviews and testimonials is a clear sense that Mayo had a profound impact on those who knew him personally, whether they were high-ranking former Sea Org members or individuals seeking a more independent path in the AAC. These voices all paint a picture of Mayo as a man dedicated to spiritual growth and genuinely believed in the power of Scientology's auditing tech. These testimonials also highlight the betrayal many felt when Mayo was expelled from the church. For people like Jesse Prince, Amy Scobee, and AAC members, Mayo's fall represented a broader loss of faith in the church under Miscavige's leadership. His treatment by Scientology was not seen as a reflection of his failures, but as evidence of the church's growing focus on the power and control rather than the spiritual advancement. In the years since, Mayo's legacy has continued to influence former Scientologists, especially those in the free zone, where his contributions to auditing remain respected. Interviews with former members consistently point to Mayo as a beacon of integrity in an organization that, to many, had lost its way.
In 1986, Time magazine published an investigative piece about Scientology titled The Thriving Cult of Greed and Power. While it focused more broadly on Scientology as a controversial organization, Mayo's defection and the subsequent litigations he faced were highlighted as examples of how Scientology retaliated against those who left. The piece framed Mayo's story as a part of a larger pattern of intimidation that included legal harassment and character assassination. Time magazine also reported on how Scientology uses tax-exempt status and its vast financial resources to overwhelm former members with lawsuits, making it nearly impossible for defectors like Mayo to fight back on equal footing. The Los Angeles Times was one of the leading newspapers covering Scientology during the 1980s, including the legal battle surrounding David Mayo. In several articles, the LA Times explored Mayo's ousting from the church and the rise of Miscavige as the new leader. Their investigative reports shed light on the internal power struggles within Scientology, with Mayo being depicted as a key figure in Hubbard's inner circle who suddenly found himself targeted. One article from the LA Times highlighted the intensity of the legal warfare ensuing after Mayo established the AAC. The paper reported on the copyrights battle initiated by Scientology and Mayo's claims that the church was using lawsuits to crush any form of dissent. This coverage contributed to a growing public awareness of how Scientology dealt with its defectors, casting the church in an increasingly negative light. Like the LA Times, the Washington Post also covered Scientology's legal actions in the 1980s. Several articles during that period focused on the broader tactics Scientology used against former high-ranking members like Mayo. The paper reported how the church employed its legal muscle to go after Mayo with accusations of intellectual property theft and trade secret violations. A notable piece by the Post described the harassment Mayo faced, including surveillance and intimidation, highlighting Scientology's fair game tactics. The portrayal of Mayo as a victim in these tactics resonated with the public's growing skepticism towards Scientology and contributed to a shift in public sentiment against the organization. Known for its more alternative take on news and culture, The Village Voice also covered Mayo's battle with Scientology. The publication focused on the human side of the story, exploring Mayo's personal journey from one of Hubbard's most trusted auditors to a figure fighting for his right to continue practicing the auditing techniques he had helped develop. The Voice articles often presented Mayo's story in a sympathetic light, portraying him as a whistleblower of sorts, someone who had been a true believer in Scientology's tech, but was now opposing the organization's descent into authoritarianism under Miscavige.
As we come to the end of David Mayo's story, we're left with a question. What is the true measure of influence? Is it the power one holds inside an organization, or the impact one leaves behind, even after they've been forced out? When Mayo was cast out of Scientology in 1982, it wasn't just a personal betrayal. It was a seismic shift within the church. Here was a man who had been at the very heart of Scientology's most sacred practices, a trusted lieutenant of L. Ron Hubbard himself, and suddenly he found himself on the outside, labeled a suppressive person. He had helped shape the tech, the processes that Scientology still holds at its core. Yet he became a target, threat, someone to be erased from their history. And yet, despite the church's efforts to vilify and silence him, the ripples of David Mayo's influence can still be felt today. His contributions to auditing, especially his work on the upper levels of Scientology's spiritual teachings, remain foundational within the church and the independent Scientology movement. Those who broke away from the official church often looked at Mayo as a figure of inspiration, a man who continued to believe in the tech even when he no longer believed in the institution behind it. You have to wonder, how many of those auditing processes still practiced today have Mayo's fingerprints all over them? How much of what Scientology teaches and uses, even now, is built on the work that Mayo poured his heart and soul into? While the official church may never acknowledge his legacy, it's undeniable that Mayo's work laid the groundwork for much of what the church holds sacred. And then there's the Free Zone, that group of independent Scientologists who continue to practice the tech without the authoritarian grip of the church. Many in this movement still revere Mayo, viewing him as a hero who dared to take Scientology's teachings back to their roots, back to a time when it wasn't about control or coercion, but about spiritual growth and personal freedom. His influence lives on in these communities where these principles he helped develop are still taught, practiced, and respected. So we're left with this thought. David Mayo may have been exiled. His name may have been dragged through the mud by the church he once helped to lead. But his legacy proves that true influence can't be erased. It lives on in the people he touched, the processes he refined, and the communities he inspired. Ultimately, the question isn't whether David Mayo changed Scientology, because he unquestionably did, but whether Scientology ever fully realized how much he left his mark. Perhaps Mayo's most significant contribution wasn't just the auditing processes he helped to build, but the courage he showed in standing up for what he believed in, even when it meant standing alone.
And that brings us to the end of today's episode. David Mayo's journey through Scientology is one of those rare, powerful, and tragic stories. This man was once at the very heart of the organization, trusted with its most sacred teachings, only to be cast out and turned into an enemy. But as we've seen, his influence didn't just disappear. Whether in the official church or in the independent communities that still practice the tech today, Mayo's legacy remains. His story leaves us with a lot to think about, doesn't it? The power dynamics, the harsh reality of what happens when you defy an institution that controls so much, and yet, the idea that influence, real influence, can transcend that. It makes you wonder how many more untold stories there are. People who played pivotal roles but were written out of the narrative. And maybe that's why it's so important to keep talking about these figures like David Mayo, who reminds us that there's always more beneath the surface. I am Abraham Ulrich. Along with Sandy McKenna, thank you for joining us on this episode of Sins of Scientology. We hope you found it as intriguing and thought-provoking as we did. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, leave a comment, and share it with someone you think may be interested. And don't forget to follow us on social media for updates on our next deep dive into the hidden stories in the annals of Scientology. Until then, keep questioning, keep seeking, and may your journey be as rich and enlightening as the stories you encounter.